All right, once again, welcome to our keynote presentation for our 2024 CMS HKBU International Research Conference. Welcome to those of you who are joining us online. We're so glad that you're here too. It's my pleasure now to welcome Professor of Sociology Sean Lauer to the podium to introduce our keynote. Sean?
Thank you. Well, it's a real pleasure for me to be able to introduce the keynote for the 2024 conference. I think it's a bit of a cliche to say that when you're introducing them to say that they need no introduction, but I think at a conference on migration studies, in this case, Nina Glick Schiller perhaps needs no introduction. It's really exciting for me to be able to be introducing Nina. I want to just mention that I actually met Nina in the 1990s, right around the time that her work on transnationalism was emerging. I actually shared an office with other graduate students a few doors down from the New Identities journal that was being started around that same exact time. My memories of Nina at that time are really of like an intellectually gregarious person, anthropologist who came to all of the sociology talks or many of the sociology talks and stayed around for the conversations afterwards. And I think since that time, like Nina's career is really sort of burgeoned, really, right? And so we're talking, it's impossible to summarize her CV. Dozens of publications, books, articles, dozens of collaborators, which for me is really notable, and multiple concepts and ideas that have really sort of driven our field, I think, in that time. For me personally, I recently reconnected with Nina's work around the concept of emplacement, which has really sort of spoken to me in some of the work I'm doing right now. Since the time that I met Nina back in the 1990s, I've had a chance to reconnect with Nina over the last week, first in Toronto and now here in Vancouver. And it's really a pleasure for me to say that I've met the same kind of gregarious intellectual, a generous intellectual who's willing to kind of share ideas and really kind of make me feel like my ideas are also brilliant as well. And so it's really been fantastic for me to reconnect with Nina, and I'm excited to invite Nina to give her keynote address for our conference today. So welcome, Nina.
Okay, I'm delighted to be here today. In ways, it felt like a powerful homecoming to hear the greeting from Elder Mary, because my very first research, my training as an anthropologist when I was a graduate student back in, if you can imagine this, 1967, was on Vancouver Island, and with the Nanaimo people who really taught me what to do and welcomed me. And so I'm invoking the spirit of Auntie Mary, who welcomed me and baked me homemade bread as I re-enter British Columbia and have a chance to talk to you about migration. What I'm going to do today is really, I want to thank the CMS leadership. It's wonderful that people and the staff that were thanked at the beginning of the conference. Usually it's the very last thing, just as people are tired and rushing off, that people get thanks. So it was lovely to begin that way. And I want to add my thanks to Anja and Sean and all the people who made this possible and invited me. And so I want to really follow up with what Daniel said and really issue a manifesto to talk about the end of migration as we know it and the need to oppose regimes of dehumanization. Michael Bass and I have written what we intend as a manifesto, a wake-up call to alert migration scholars, activists, and policymakers to the fact that we're entering a time of new migration regimes of dehumanization. While we have all been busy developing our new scholarships about barriers to integration, the lives of skilled migrants, the growth of international student population, transnational social fields. Meanwhile, And we've been theorizing all these things and theorizing belonging, but meanwhile, the world has been rapidly changing. It is becoming increasingly impossible for most migrants to move and settle permanently, let alone to build transnational ties as they did in previous generations. Much of our migration scholarship, I have to say, developed within the context that allowed people to enter a nation state in which they were not born, settle, and obtain full rights and protections from their new states. There might have been barriers and struggles and losses along the way, but there was that possibility in one way or another. These regimes that allowed people to settle existed in the Americas, Western Europe, and often in colonies these imperial powers controlled around the world. So our manifesto is a call to recognize and oppose this ending of migration as we know it. Our argument has the following premises. One, it is increasingly impossible for most migrants to move and settle permanently and build transnational social fields, a theme of this conference. Two, the transformations we're experiencing reflect the political, economic reorganization of capitalism globally. Three, these changes threaten all of us, migrants and non-migrants alike. I want to stress, we must look at the planetary conditions of environmental destruction, war, and the growth of a world of precarious employment that we are all confronting in order to find a way to the better world to which we aspire. By calling on scholars, activists, and policymakers to confront the end of migration as we know it, we are not only offering a proposition about the current state of affairs, but trying to provide tools for the future, for future research, for future struggles. This manifesto is a challenge to think about the cumulative results of the intense anti-migration politics of the present day, which Daniel has mentioned, and to raise new research questions about the future of mobility across borders, especially when it concerns those seeking to establish lives and livelihoods elsewhere. Consequently, we must stand back from our current discussions and theories to examine the actual conditions that mobile populations now face and whether they can obtain secure lives with employment, housing, and legal protection. In order to confront these current transformations, it's urgent that we found our scholarship on a commitment to the basic human right to social and economic justice and dignity. In this transforming world, receiving nations may offer permanency and fast-track rules for permanent residency and citizenship to those categorized as desirable migrants. But most migrants are only of interest to employers in terms of labor extraction. Notions of enforced transience or permanent temporariness that were written into prominent temporary migration schemes in Asia, and here I build on the work of Brenda Yeo and her colleagues in Singapore, are now becoming a new global norm. Increasingly, low-wage migrant workers, but increasingly numbers of professionals and asylum seekers and students who are permitted to labor but not to settle. We must connect the emerging migration regimes of permanent temporariness to the dehumanization of migrants we are seeing globally, from Mexico to the Mediterranean to Gaza. The UN reported that in the first 9 months of 2023, more than 2,500 people died trying to cross the Mediterranean. And they're just being allowed to drown more and more. Texas officials erected barriers in the river boundary between Mexico and the US, which caused migrants to drown midstream while Texas border guards looked on. The US-Mexico border is the culmination of the world's deadliest land migration route, with 1,457 migrant deaths and disappearances at least, those are the documented ones, in 2023. And the UNHCR in 2022 reported there were 4.3 million stateless persons, and their count didn't include the millions of Palestinians who are stateless. We're seeing the creation of stateless people and refugees as unfree populations with no rights to mobility, defense, life, protection, or a future. When I see this drowning, I think of my grandmother who almost drowned crossing a river in the middle of the winter, trying to leave Russia and get to Hamburg and migrate to the United States, and was rescued by Polish peasants. We must connect the emerging migration regimes of permanent temporary, oh, I've said that. Okay, sorry. So we're living in a moment of politics that values the categorizing power of the nation state over human lives. These trends mean the dehumanization of us all. As we witness the annihilation of women, men, and children in Gaza, the potency of the message that certain populations are valued less than others is unfolding before our eyes. As stateless persons, Palestinians have lived as refugees without civil rights for 7 decades now. Yet those responsible for the current mass murder, including the US and Israel, and I speak as someone of Jewish background, whose ancestors died in the Holocaust, we're only recognizing Israel's right of self-defense and not the right of stateless people everywhere. The point is that when people are defined as refugees or stateless, it produces a politics that devalues the centrality and sanctity of human lives. But furthermore, states have the power to deny rights by criminalizing or categorizing any one of us at any time as undeserving or threatening others. Students and faculty, protesters, standing with the Palestinians who suddenly found that they were defined as trespassers on their own campuses have had a lesson that maybe they didn't learn in the classroom about the categorizing power of private corporations and state institutions. I'm a former trespasser from 1968. If and when we acknowledge the commonalities of those allocated by states to permanent temporariness, we can see this emerging global trend of people working and contributing to various states around the world, giving their lives for these states, but not benefiting from their work. They build cities but have no rights to permanently live there or raise and educate their families in places they have built. Often they don't even have the right to have housing or protection of the law, even if they work with legal contracts. We see this with internal migrants. It's not just transnational migration. We see this with rural-urban migrants in Indian cities who construct housing for the wealthy, are forced to camp out on the construction site, and are discarded afterwards. They share a situation of rightlessness, even though legal citizens of their own country, with migrant workers recruited to the Gulf states or Singapore, with contracts that offer no legal protections to settle, obtain workplace protection, or even question brutal treatment, and who can never become citizens. This exclusionary policy increasingly includes skilled workers. In places like Singapore, it's been true for a long time in the Gulf state, and it's becoming truer in many states around the world, including Europe. When my work visa expired in the UK, I was legal. I would have been illegal if I had stayed one day longer. If and when we acknowledge the commonalities of those allocated, let me see, sorry, to move beyond past categorizations that define refugees here, international students there, skilled professionals there, obscures these commonalities. So we have to move beyond these categorizations to build the scholarship and politics for our times. Michael and I summarize our end of migration as we know it argument in 5 foundational precepts. 1, current migration scholarship is mired in theories about migration that reflect recent regimes, infrastructure, and legalities. There is, of course, a long history of unfree, super-exploited labor, including slavery, undocumented migrants, and short-term labor, all forms of deploying workers in projects of building nation states without granting them rights to citizenship in these states. But even non-immigration countries in the past, as I mentioned, had some pathway to citizenship. You could open a business, find certain kinds of employment, be accepted as a refugee, marry a citizen, have a baby. It varied, but there were these pathways. This could be done in many ways, and all these ways are slowly being reduced or completely eliminated. Our current migration scholarship, however, is built on theories about migration that reflect the assumptions that migrants can become immigrants and settlers. Think about our key concepts, whether it's been assimilation or multiculturalism or transnationalism, and the current favorite in Canada, integration. These are built on a view that people are permanently settling with rights. The migration narrative remains one that acknowledges barriers and sacrifices, but assumes that these difficulties will be followed by settlement, the building of transnational social fields, family reunion, and chain migration. Precept 2. However, as I have been pointing out, current migration regimes are eliminating the right to settle, the right to have rights. The historic undercurrent is becoming the global trend. As in so many nations, national policies are creating a halak class, people deemed unfree, rightless labor, a whole class of people around the world without rights. This term was first used by Robin Cohn in migration studies as early as 1987, but he reissued his book last year in 2023, and now it seems to be right on time. Countries in Europe, the Middle East, Asia Pacific, and North America increasingly have narrowed the options for permanent residence and citizenship with a growing use of temporary workers. Temporary workers are on contract or asylum seekers deployed as temporary workers in multiple industries include agriculture, meat packing, health and caregiving. Employers are able to extract the maximum value from these workers' labor and then throw them away. The changes in migration regimes and in our precept 3 and the growth of a halak class is part and and parcel of the reorganization of forms of capital accumulation. This is very important to not only describe, but theorize why it's happening. Why? Why now? And we see that there's now a historical conjuncture of a crisis of profits in which there is an intensification of hyper-exploitation combined with the accumulation of capital by dispossessing people, by privatizing public land, housing, and the infrastructure which provides us all with transport, health, education, and childcare. These are all becoming sources of corporate ultra wealth or private equity. These transformations produce industries organized for maximum profit and make the work of citizens and migrants more precarious. Temporary work, whether for citizens or non-citizens, produces life with fewer or no rights, protections, benefits, and with lower real wages adjusted for inflation. Meanwhile, politicians direct citizens' anger to migrants, even as an increasing percentage of the population, migrants or non-migrants, citizens or non-citizens, are facing precarious working conditions, homelessness, and food shortages, as well as the increasing deterioration of health care, with women dying for lack of maternity care, even in the advanced nations. It's horrible in the US right now. Precept 4, we are seeing the growth of migration industries, and this is important to stress, how much migration has now become a set of industries that facilitate mobility across borders by profiting from our newly transformed migration regimes. So first you intensify the border, it becomes harder, you distinguish more and more between migrant and non-migrant, and then you find ways to profit from that difference. The migration industry can be defined as the nexus of private and public organizations, non-government organizations, and government agencies that profit from human mobility. It's linked together through a globe-spanning networks of corporations, criminal networks, traffickers, state and educational institutions, humanitarian organizations, and multinational border agencies such as Frontex. Nation states' investment in developing and streamlining deportation regimes has to a large extent fostered the growth of these migration industries as a source of private profit and an intense form of capital accumulation. My welcome to Dayton sign. I used to live near Dayton, Ohio. Yet there is hope. Support is growing for migrant rights and options to settle. We see welcomes from city mayors and councils in multiple countries, certainly in Canada as well as in the US. The Midwestern struggling city of Dayton, Ohio, posted this sign: "Welcome to Dayton, immigrant-friendly city." Social justice movements are growing against all forms of oppression. This is most recently visible in the movement to stop the war in Gaza, but social movements have been growing to protect rights of migrants and non-migrants everywhere. Business interests state their support for migrants too, which is really an interesting contradiction between the political narratives and the business narratives. For example, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce recently noted we are missing 1.7 million Americans from the workforce compared to February 2020, and they couple that with a call for more migration. And the Royal Bank of Canada noted Canada's population grew by a substantial 3.3% from 2022 to 2023, almost entirely by in-migration. So, where does that, right? Yeah, so that was the fifth precept, and it leads us to a set of conclusions. I'm making this talk rather short because I want us to discuss this rather than me going on and on. I'd like us to think together about where we are as migration researchers. So the conclusion is the attack on migrants is really a canary in the coal mine. We have now these wonderful centers for migration studies, which didn't exist at all when I started my migration research. And it's wonderful to see. But we have to be careful not to separate the study of migration from what's going on in the rest of the society. We need concepts that can link them with what Aisha Scheller and I've been working on for the last few decades, actually, because what happens to migrants is part of what's happening to us all, and we need ways to be able to explain that rather than seeing it as something that happens to strangers or something that happens over there. These attacks are a signal of a broad denial of the fundamental principle that governments should be responsible to and for the welfare of ordinary people. Attacks on migrants paved the way to the current denial of the rights of citizens to shelter and the failure of cities to house their people. So we see homelessness everywhere of migrants and non-migrants. In Canada, in Toronto, in New York, in smaller cities, I see it through Germany. At the same time, these attacks on migrants and non-migrants are justified by increasing racialization of labor, attacks on unions and worker protections, the strengthening of patriarchal values, norms, and hierarchies, increasing racism, and the denigration of cultural diversity. We are all facing increasingly authoritarian regimes with new limitations on rights from voting to education to free speech. Again, we've been seeing this on campuses. The message is, if you're displaced or your job is precarious or you're unemployed, you are disposable. What I've been saying is that a disposariat is being created. So, what do we do about it? Well, as researchers, one thing we do is develop a new set of research questions that can speak to our times and to the future, not to the past. We need a new research agenda based on the understanding that migration is a social good. That's foundational. That generates 6 questions. Okay. Question 1. Is immigration still possible for most people who seek a new life elsewhere? We can't just assume it. We have to assess what's happening. 2, what kind of moral and political world will we confront if people fleeing war, violence, and environmental destruction have no right of refuge, as we see that right denied with people dying and drowning, from all around the world? 3, how will everyone's life and liberties be damaged in a world in which workers are given only temporary status? And we can't just switch. All right, now we're studying labor contracts. Now we're studying temporary workers. See, we have a new topic of research. We have to ask how that affects us to have this rightless population. Question 4. Are we entering a world when those who migrate, whether defined as refugees or workers, are defined as disposable? Question 5. How can we respond to the needs of cities and rural areas for people to come, settle, build families, businesses, and institutions by making it clear that migration is a social good? Rural areas everywhere are being depopulated. and they're losing all services, and then they lose their schools, and then they lose their health care. We see this in the United States. I've seen this in Scandinavia. If there's no health care, no education, you see it in Japan. Then people can't live in the village. Then they have to go somewhere else. They need people. Number 6, how can we reunite migrants and non-migrants in the struggle to save the planet while providing health, food, clean water, and a decent shelter for all of us? I thank you.
Okay, so thank you so much, Nita, for such a thought-provoking talk. I think if there's one way we could describe your talk, it's certainly thought-provoking, and I think now it's just time for questions. We have about I don't have my watch, but we have a little bit of time for questions. So if anyone would have a question for Nina, I'd welcome it from the crowd. We also have some people online where we might hear some questions. In the back, yeah, thank you. I think we have a microphone. Thank you.
Thank you, Nina, for your talk. I'm from Dominican Republic, and I remember your work. I remember your work in the 90s about transnationalism, very important for my own research. I'm a literary scholar, so it's kind of weird to talk about transnationalism. But in Dominican Republic, we have seen a legal line of attack on migrants. And I think that we kind of go away from that fight. Is that my question is, how do you build research agenda for that legal aspect in which, for example, in Dominican Republic, it was entrenched in the Constitution that children born of undocumented parents are not citizens, right?
Excuse me, it's just with the mic in this room, I have a hard time hearing, so just speak slowly. And what was?
So my intervention is about the legal aspect of migration, where you have cases like in Dominican Republic, where it's actually in the Constitution that children born of undocumented parents have no right whatsoever to citizenship. So where do we go from here in that beautiful manifesto that you have? Like, I think is one of the things that I think is a challenge for us to think about that.
Yes, I'm aware of that. I mean, and that law was was relatively recently changed in the Dominican Republic. It's gone back and forth, in terms of the rights. Really, it's an attack on Haitians who have helped build the Dominican Republic for a long time. Thank you for that question, because it's exactly what I'm trying to get to. The legal regimes are changing around us. It's not just in the Dominican Republic. There's an effort in a number of places. There's proposal in the United States to only make natives, whoever, and then they're not talking about indigenous people, children, citizens, and to deny the rights of immigrants to people born from immigrant parents to become citizens. This is a legal attack that's broadly being instituted, and it's part of a wave of nationalism that directs all our attention away from the deterioration of the life chances of people defined as having a right of being citizens. Their lives are being attenuated too, and their anger is being deflected toward immigration and to migrants. So I'm calling on all of us to see this as a global trend, to document and be aware of this trend in our research, and then build social movements to affirm the right of people to migrate, and also the right of everyone to a decent life. That's why I'm saying we can't separate the rights of migrants and the struggle from migrants from the struggles of the rest of the population, who are rightly angry because their standards of living are decreasing and the possibilities for their children are decreasing, and their hopes for the future are decreasing. We have to put those hopes and aspirations together, as Professor Loom said, so that we can talk about the protection of humanity together. So that question really is part of my talking about the canary in the coal mine, that warns you that there's toxic gas that will kill us all.
Hi, Professor Schiller. Thank you for this really thought-provoking manifesto. I have two questions / comments to sort of continue the conversation, and I'm struck by sort of the new era that you're kind of defining and calling our attention to. But I'm also struck by the fact that you kind of hearkened at numerous points in your talk about a previous paradigm shift in migration, which was the Second World War, and sort of the rise in some ways of many of these now somewhat obsolete sort of paradigms or ways of thinking about migration, assimilation, integration, refugeehood. Like all of those, in many cases, arise if at the very least became institutionalized, right, in the wake of the Second World War and the numerous sort of nation-state boundaries that were hardened back then. And furthermore, like thinking about sort of the ways in which people before that paradigm shift, before the rise of the international refugee regime, the rise of the international migration regime, also had to face migration boundaries, but also in some ways the scholarship on that period, historically speaking, has dwelled a lot more on refusal and persistence and the mere sort of presence of migrant bodies as sort of an inertial force in responding to state sort of institutions and regimes of exclusion. So I'm wondering, what is your thoughts about sort of placing the current era that we are in that broader, longer historical context? Are there any lessons from that period of time that we can apply today, or are we facing something completely new?
Thank you for that question. I think we do need a historical perspective. Actually, I've written about it over the years, the different periods, and tried to link it to different stages of the organization of capitalism. Because I think unless we look more broadly and understand what's happening in terms of the political economy around the world, we can't understand why there are these changing migration policies. And they haven't been lineal. There have been times when borders have been closed. There have been times when they eliminated passports. In the period when there was a vast need for industrial labor, both in Europe and the US, countries eliminated passports, but countries that had people who wanted to leave tried to keep their population in, right? So my grandparents were actually escaping Russia. That's how they almost drowned. They were sneaking out in the middle of the night on a sled through the snow to get out, to cross the Russian border, because Russia wanted to keep their population in so they could industrialize too. So we need that fine reading of history to understand what was happening in terms of migration policies. And after World War I, there was a closing down of the passports were created, nationalism grew, national scholarships grew. So each country had its own national take on migration, and we have to break out of that also to have this global perspective. So, but my argument is that certainly this closing down is not new. It's happened before in different ways, but it's not a cycle. History is neither linear nor cyclical, because capitalism keeps changing and reorganizing, and in each reorganization, there are new challenges and new kinds of crises, and we have to be aware of that. And now we have a planetary crisis in terms of the environment that's bearing down on us, while we have these large corporations saying more oil, more, go, 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 and accelerating the rate of environmental decline.
We have a question online, so. Oh, apologize. Maybe we'll go on to.
Sorry, people online. So I think you really, put your finger on something so fundamental that is changing in terms of the way that extractive capitalism and nationalism is transforming how migrants are treated. And you talk about the lack of permanence. And I just want to throw in two other things and see whether you can help me connect all of that. One is technology and how that is also giving rise to a new transnationalism in terms of AI and remote work and digital nomads, right? This whole new term of laboring. And then mobility for the hyper privileged, right? Who have mobility but do not settle out of their own volition. Where does all of that fit into that new era of dehumanization that you've described to us?
Yes. I was looking for the picture I had of the airplane landing on the beach of the hyper-privileged, but I didn't find it. Well, I think technology is everywhere, but I'm not a technological determinist. When we first started talking about transnationalism, there were a lot of people who were writing, yes, we have people living their lives across borders because now we have cell phones, or first it was cassettes. First we have these new technologies, we have airplanes. That's why we have people living in transnational social fields. That was historically all wrong. My grandparents came in the 1890s, sent letters back and forth, and until their families were killed in World War I or II. So people communicated by whatever means there were, and they built transnational social fields with whatever technology they were. Technology doesn't drive this. Technology reflects the politics and the organization of capitalism at the time. People used to get letters very quickly, actually. So we need to see how AI, with surveillance and increasing surveillance, how people are tracked through the Sahara Desert, how their cell phones give them away, how their cell phones are surveilled for their networks. All this stuff is very invasive and frightening. It's invasive for us all, but it's not what's driving it. That's all I'm trying to say, that we really have to look more broadly to understand how the technology is used. It could be used to really facilitate so much in our lives rather than surveil us and take away some of our basic rights.
Thank you. Now our colleague Lisa will share a question from the online chat room. Thank you. Thank you. So there are two questions in the chat. I'll ask both of them and see maybe they could be related. The first is, can the people of their own land be migrants? Please consider the example of Palestine. What could be a possible solution in this regard? And the second question is, some people claim that nations have the right to welcome and reject some immigrant groups, but I do not know how to respond to that claim. How do you respond?
Okay. Two very important and fundamental questions. Let me answer the second one first because it links to the question of Palestine and nations. To me, again, we need history. Nations are a historical construction of the modern era. Not that there weren't identities around which people killed each other ever since there have been states. You can read it in the Old Testament. You can read it in the Babylonian narratives. You can read it in the laws of Hammurabi or in the Mexican chronicles or whatever. So states, and especially states that are expanding, have always defined who belongs and who doesn't, the Roman concept of barbarian or whatever. But you also, if you go back in history, see the immense permeability of those borders and identities in various state histories in the past. Okay, so yes, they define difference, but actually, you know, you go in England to the Hadrian's Wall, and you find it was built by Roman soldiers from Eastern Europe. You know, so the Roman army also took in people, and they became Romans and Roman soldiers and defined the empire. This is different than the imagined communities as Benedict Anderson spoke about in terms of the history of modern nation states. These are political projects to define who belonged and didn't belong in terms of legitimating the state once it wasn't legitimated by loyalty to the sovereign. So if you had a republic, you know, and you wanted to define who was the sovereign, it was the people. Starting actually with the French Revolution, there's a concept of the people. And the people of Haiti know that there was a debate, you know, because there are a lot of people from Haiti in France, in Paris, and they said, we're part of the people too. I mean, they were the Haitian elite, but they were there. And so the question was, who are the French people? And the end result after struggle was defined racially and in terms of an imagined history of relationship to a particular piece of territory and boundaries. That and the concept of nation state, territorialized, imagined, racially pure group of people, totally manufactured fictional biology is the basis of all modern nation states. They're all about race. At the end of the day, they're all about race, including in the United States, which is about whiteness. Okay, that's how the nation is built. The only way to deal with that is to repudiate the concept. It's invalid. Yeah, it's based on the wrong science and the wrong history. There are no nations in the sense that people who claim they have a right to have their descendants in this thing. This is a fictional history everywhere. Okay. Having said that, we entered a situation where one people's fictional history is against another fictional history. So in Palestine, you can say on one hand, it's an imagination also. But on the other hand, that the imagination that only Jewish people have a right to that land is being used to kill other people and their claims. Okay, so we have to enter into it, say, okay, everyone creates their history, but no one has a right to eliminate someone else in the name of racial claims. And it's what Nazi Germany did, it's what Israel's doing, and it's what the United States is trying to do via Trump and his kind of politics. So in the end, I say we're in a struggle against ideas about race. And unless we struggle against those, we can't enter into the politics of the contemporary world.
Thank you. Is there another question?
Thank you, Professor. It was a wonderful keynote. I was compelled by your call to us to reframe migration as a social good. You also said we can start from that premise in a new research agenda. I wanted to hear, are there any dangers or drawbacks that we need to keep in mind if we move forward with the framing of migration as a social good?
Well, certainly. Thank you. Certainly from the point of view of indigenous people, migration has not been a social good. Although, I mean, I mean, humans have always moved, always. We would not be a single species if we hadn't constantly intermingled. This is true of native populations here, indigenous populations here and everywhere. They moved over time. People have moved in relationship to changing environmental conditions and changing political conditions for millennia, for multiple millennia. So I think we have to begin the discussion there. Having said that, I'm saying not only is migration a social good, migration is a human experience. It is part of what makes us what we are, and that's what makes it so precious. No one ever could have, humans could not have evolved if they stayed in a territory. We wouldn't be here, and the planet won't be here unless we acknowledge our common human history. I don't know if that answers your question. That's where I begin.
Thank you, Dr. Schiller. You alluded to this topic in your talk.
No, I'm going to need some help because when I now see, I hear the voices up close, but I don't hear the voices in the back. Thank you.
Thank you. I also have, thank you for your talk. I really enjoyed it. This question has been alluded to already in your talk when you mentioned about the categorizing power of nation states over human lives. And when you mentioned that governments and states ultimately have the responsibility for the welfare of its people. And so my question is, what do you envision to be the ideal role of the state and multilateral agencies in light of 3 points that you made on nation states being, fictional ideology-based constructions, to that it's nation states that ultimately have the right to look after their people's welfare, and 3, that there are existing social justice movements such as No One is Legal and Open Borders. How do we hasten or enable the withering away of the state, as someone famous said centuries ago? Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm not an anarchist. I mean, I think we need states, we need institutions, we need to organize we need them to organize redistribution, basically. And that's what they're not doing right now. They're organizing concentrations of wealth rather than redistributions of wealth. It can be different. It's very difficult because the people who are invested in maximizing their wealth always resist. Social movements are certainly have to be raising these questions constantly with a vision of the state. It's interesting, again, I can go back to my experience with Haiti. It's interesting to start there. I mean, I went to Haiti with a friend and colleague, Georges Ferron, and he said, we have to do this interview and we have to ask people of their idea of the state. And I said, George, we can't do that. I mean, this is a political science question. How are we going to get people who are illiterate? We're going to do these interviews in the squatter settlements about the state. He said, we're going to do it. So he walks into the first household and he says, so, l'État, what do you think of the state? He said in Creole, and people say, the state should be responsible to the people. No, they didn't hesitate. We went to the next household. People said, the state should be responsible to the people. Now, the Haitian state has almost never been responsible, maybe never, but they had a vision of another possibility, and it has fueled struggles over the centuries, and we need that vision. Okay, that's what I would say. You're raising a fundamental question, because the basic thing is is to have some fundamental premises of what we need, okay, in order to be able to struggle for it. Now, in terms of open borders and social movements like that, that's again where history comes in. There were open borders, so it's not an impossible thing. It's not some kind of everybody will be flooded, that you've got this contradiction. You've got even the Chamber of Commerce in the US saying, we need people. You've got all through Europe states saying, we need people. That, you've got Canada saying, we need people. Then they say skilled people, but actually, you can't have a city unless there's somebody who drives the taxi, and I'm not for AI driving cars, but anyway, especially in cities, but and people who clean and take care of elderly and take care of children and take care of people. You need people of all, and those are skilled jobs. Those are very skilled. They're just not skills that are recognized as skilled. You need all these skills to make a city work. So you have this need, and then you have this denial that you should open the borders. Now, I went back and looked at the numbers that came through Ellis Island at the peak of U.S. migration before World War I. And I found that the numbers were exactly the same as what people are defining as the crisis of the border, at the U.S.-Mexican border now. And these people went through Ellis Island. 97% were accepted. They had a health examination with X-rays at the time. They had health examination, X-rays. They had, they asked them questions. They asked them about their background. They spoke to them in whatever language they spoke in, and they did it within a day, the day. They did it every day with no computers, not even with typewriters. You can see the handwritten records in many cases. If there's a political will, you can do it. If there's no political will, it's impossible, crisis, awful, being where and being invaded, everything. So it's the narrative and the will, not the actual fact that we're facing right now.
Hi, thank you so much for your presentation again. My question is kind of related to this issue.
Wait. Slowly, please.
Yes, sorry, I speak very fast. I was wondering about the point you made about governments or states being responsible for people.
Wait. I'm coming closer.
I can come closer.
You.
Oh, thanks.
Thank you.
And taking into account that there are some states that are not being responsible already for their people, so that makes them migrate. And then they go to more advanced states that are now not wanting to be responsible for the welfare of people either. How can we think of, in practical terms, of migration? Because these are people that are migrating at working age, contributing with their taxes, and maybe building pensions in states where they are not going to be able to settle, and they are going to go back to their country of origin, because where else can they go, or maybe a third country? And how can we think in practical terms of what to do with both the money that is being created for more advanced countries that are not going to provide services versus the money that is not staying in states where they left? I don't know if that makes sense. If I talk too fast.
Can you say that a little bit more again? I am sorry.
No, it's okay.
It's not you. It's my strange hearing. I can't hear my granddaughter.
No, it's okay. Should I use the microphone or just? I think it makes it worse.
I guess other people may hear it. Yeah.
Oh yeah, I think it makes it kind of worse. Okay, I'll try to speak slow. Okay, so my question is, when people migrate because states are not providing welfare for them, and then they go create money for advanced societies, which also do not want to provide welfare for them, but they are contributing with taxes and their jobs to building the economies. What happens when these people reach retirement age and they are not able to settle in the country of origin, in the country of migration, and then when they go back to country of origin, there's no pensions, and also no migration status?
Now I get it. Now all I have to do is get there. All right. Working on balance. Okay. That's That's exactly what I'm worrying about. I mean, that's what the kinds of things we have to pay more attention to, not saying, oh, a lot of contract workers. I mean, the Philippines face this a great deal, and many other countries that are actually literally exporting. National governments are profiting. This is part of the migration industry. They're profiting by exporting their population to someplace else, you know, getting the remittances and not providing for their population when they return, you know. Meanwhile, just as you said, people are building someplace else, giving their labor, their best energy, their health to some other country. And then the politicians have the audacity to say, you know, the migrants are taking from us. Look at all the wealth the migrants are taking from us. No, no, no. Look at all the wealth the migrants are giving to every single country and their health and their youth. And then, you know, and then when they retire, they have nothing to retire on. At the same time, you know, more and more pensions in these countries don't support the people either. So that's why I'm saying we have to look at this together. How is the standard of living of everyone being reduced by these policies of temporariness and the ability of the state not to be responsible to not the people, national people, but the people who make the society go. And I've always said to my students, when they say, oh, these migrants are taking their wealth, I say, no, they're following their wealth. You know, the wealth is being extracted from their country. The country raises, if it's a case of migration, the country, until they were at working age, they were fed and educated, and very often highly educated by their country. All that wealth was put into them. And then the other country who didn't have to educate them and raise them and make sure that they lived to adulthood is benefiting. In addition to all the wealth that's just being extracted from extractive industries around the world. So we've got, the narrative is backwards. We have to speak to the narrative. We have to speak strongly and clearly. We can't just go along with whatever policies are happening and research those. If we want to have a migration scholarship that's responsible, that's factual, and that speaks to our times.
I think we have a question in the back.
Thank you so much. I've been reading your work for a very long time, and it's been very influential. So it's wonderful to hear you speak at this juncture. Two questions. The first one is really circles back to a question that we heard earlier around migration as a social good, which I was really struck by too, and how we square that with the value of place-based attachment, which I think comes back
a little slowly. I'm sorry.
Yeah, so
drive people crazy.
How we bring the idea of migration as a social good into balance and ongoing relation with the idea of place-based attachment as a social good, whether we're thinking of that in terms of indigeneity or other forms of connection to the land and to place. And so I think we're in a moment where there's a very strong emphasis on that value, as well as a strong emphasis, you know, as you're outlining it on migration as a social good. So I'm just wondering sort of analytically, but also pragmatically, how we bring those two values into shared relation moving forward.
Thank you. That's very important. It's interesting about part of the problem is we just assume. I've done interviews with migrants from all over the world in other, you know, in different parts of the world. And most people I know form an attachment to their city, their space. Maybe not the whole country, but most citizens don't really have an attachment to the whole country. It's mostly to their region of the country. Or, my husband grew up in the Boston area, and he has this Boston identity. I have this New York identity. We're always battling about which is the more the. But I've gone to Manchester in New Hampshire, not the UK one, but the one in New Hampshire, and I've talked to migrants, and it's sort of a down and out city, a deindustrialized, disempowered, impoverished city. And people, and people identify with it, people from Latin America, people from all over the world, if they migrate there and they stay there, they identify with Manchester, New Hampshire. That's part of their identity. It's not their only identity. That's part of the problem. And it's written into a lot of our migration research as if people only had one identity or one kind of belonging. We're very complex creatures. We have multiple identities at the same time, and it depends on which one, you sort of bring to the surface in your political discourse. So I think that the divide between migrant and non-migrant is a false one, even around the question of space, because people do identify with their space. If you migrate and it's not just, you see it in global cities. I mean, there's the local New York identity, for example, or London and Paris, but it's also in down and out cities. And I've also seen it in Halle in Eastern Germany. And a lot of the people who do migrant research and migrant services actually came from other parts of Germany. And they came to Halle because they saw it, although it has a negative reputation in Germany. They came as students and they saw it as a city with social movements and a progressive city and a city with childcare. And they stayed, and now it's their city, Important to keep an ear for that formation of local identities. And localism can actually bring us together rather than separate.
A bit closer. Thank you for your manifesto. And I'm ready to follow you right along behind. But my question is really, I'd like to hear more about your politics of hope. And I'm thinking of, the amazing migrant organizing that's been happening in Vancouver for the last 30 years around precisely these temporary foreign worker programs. So it would be the seasonal agricultural worker program and the living caregiver program. Amazing organizing. And yet it's been, it's very hard to see that organizing has been very effective. So I put that together, kind of a close kind of watching of that organizing of the last 30 years. With that curious, the slide where you had
again, is it? Okay.
So this is sort of asking you to think more about how we might build up this politics of hope, and kind of worrying about the lack of effectiveness of this very effective migrant organizing that's been going on in Canada around temporary foreign workers for the last 35 years. And so I'm curious as well about your slide where you have the Royal Bank as, tied into your kind of politics of hope. So could you expand more on how you see us building this coalition between these vibrant migrant organizations that just haven't been able to move the state very effectively?
Right. Okay. I want to this and have it move. I'll just stand here, and then if it rolls, I'll roll with it. Okay. Well, there's a contradiction in the corporate interest in migration. I mean, they know that they can't have an economy without a labor force, and they know that the labor force has to be provided by migration, not just by natural production. I think that's why the Republicans have eliminated abortion, because they want native people, they want women to just stay home and be barefoot and pregnant and produce the population to work rather than migrants. They don't say it that way, but this is the only thing that makes sense to me. But anyway, so they have this contradiction. They need the labor. If they can organize it all through temporary labor, they'd love to do that, because the temporary labor has no rights at all. So on one hand, they're allies, but they're very particular kinds of allies. But we have to also welcome their narrative, because at least it points out that migration is a good, but we have to understand what kind of allies they are. And I mean, in terms of hope, I mean, I have to say, I've always been fairly hopeful that we will organize and we will, fight, fail, but finally win some justice. And I've been much less hopeful watching how successful the Republican narrative is, not just in the United States, the Trumpian fascist narrative, but with networks and organizations all around the world, including to certain kinds of Christianity and certain churches and all kinds of actors who care about people actually, but are brought into this kind of blame, racialized blame that's accelerating that movement. But on the other hand, if we step back and we look at that this is linked to crises crises of capital accumulation, then we also see their weaknesses. That's why I'm saying we really have to have this broader. It's not, oh, no, that's just economics. I don't need that. I'm a migration scholar. I mean, migration has everything to do with economics and politics and values. And so we have to see that this is a politics of crisis and desperation. We have to see their desperation so we don't get desperate. That's what I'm saying. And then we have to see our strength. After all, we are most of the people in the world, and we are the ones that do the work and create the world. And we have to hold that very tightly in order to get through what we're facing right now, I think.
So if it's okay with you, Nina, we started a little late, so maybe we'll take another question or two before we started a little bit late, so
Yes.
maybe we'll take another question or two
Okay.
before we wrap up, if that's okay with you.
Whenever.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Nina, for your thoughts and views. You mentioned about social good. You also mentioned about the contributions of migrants. Political will is something that we wanted to persuade to happen. And you also mentioned about narratives. One of the things I personally find that is in the academic world, when we look into the issues of migration, we often divide ourselves into, I'm a sociologist, I look at phenomenon. I'm a social worker, I look for advocacy. I'm a nurse, I look for healthcare access. But I would argue that in order to change political will, we need good narratives. And narratives comes from things that would change the mind of people. And I always feel that the double standard, even within an individual, is always the origin of our biases and prejudice, which further fueled the political whatever power and strength. So my question is, do you see other ways or other disciplines or academic arena that we can solicit the involvement so as to make our stories to be stronger and more persuasive, not in the sense of just doing, well, we have lots of successful social movement, but obviously social movement are staging in a way that, yes, you create some change, but you also create confrontation and the cycle or a never-ending cycle of confrontation. I'm not saying it is wrong. I think social movement has a strong value on it, but are there any other approaches or other knowledge base that we can draw upon to tell our stories better?
Yes.
Yeah.
I'm really loving these questions, but and basically I felt when I was speaking, I was just saying what you had said much more succinctly in your first comments about what's happening in the world right now, and you're raising an important question. I think, I mean, I've never been a disciplinary person, and that's why, even though I have this base in anthropology, and that's why I love migration studies, because it pulls people from all these different backgrounds to talk about a common understanding of a human experience and how to build a common understanding and respond to that human experience. I directed a research institute on cosmopolitan culture in University of Manchester in England, and we had people from film studies and literature and history and languages and social sciences. And it was a startling experience for me in one way. The people in film studies and literature got their sense of migration from films and books. Now, if you're going to write a novel or a film, you need a dramatic premise. You need attention. And so that a lot of them, the tension is about difference and otherness. So they were sure that nobody, there wasn't any cosmopolitan, even though they were part of this institute, domain, what I call domains of commonality. There was just difference that you had to overcome. You had toleration for strangers and philosophy too, And I would go out on the streets of Manchester every day, and people would just relate to each other without this sense of hospitality to strangers. They would interact. Sean and I have been talking about this. They would just interact in daily life with people from all over, which I know happens in Vancouver and in Toronto, but in small cities too, and small scale cities. And so we need narratives, and there are disciplines that build narratives, but it was a real struggle to overcome what they had learned from the narratives that were built into their disciplines. I mean, this was really a wake-up call to me. And I'm still puzzling over that. So yes, films and fiction and plays and all kinds of creative arts and art, of all kinds, need to be part of this message. But we've got to first get the message straight. And there was a time in my life, after the 60s, when I decided to go out and organize. I left academia because I thought we need to change the world. And when I got there, people kept telling me people are basically greedy, people are basically aggressive, all kinds of ideas that I knew came from the academy. In fact, they often came from Harvard. They were They were academic ideas that then were popularized. And I decided to go back to the academy because some of the things we're doing are in this research is basic to taking on those dominant narratives. It's very useful to train people, or and that people hate each other, that we're just basically humans are aggressive. All of anthropology says this is not so. Most of anthropology, except at Harvard, says this is not true. So I came back because I realized that what we're doing here is very, very important to contribute to the mainstream narratives, to combat them. That we're not in an ivory tower, that our ideas gets disseminated, not just when we write a letter to the editor, but in all kinds of ways through classrooms and now with social media everywhere. So we have to create this positive view of migration. We have to create this defense of humanity, and we have to disseminate it through every discipline we can. I hope that answers your question.
Perhaps we have time for one more question, or maybe it's a good time.
Well, it's all solved. We can party.
I think I want to say just thank you to Nina one more time, and